everybody, First Go Productions here, and I have a question to ask you today. What would you think when I say the word Southwestern Ohio? Well, whatever it is, it's probably not much. It's probably just cornfields and maybe all the memes about Ohio. Well, my point is, there's really nothing unique in Ohio, and Western Ohio. But I bet none of you were thinking of this. This is the Knokov&Northern Railroad. In its present-day form, it runs from Junction City to Costco, Ohio. Quick disclaimer, the Knokov&Northern isn't real. This is just fiction. I actually have an entire series revolving around the railroad that I recommend you go check out. But today, we're not only looking at what the KNN is, we're also looking at its history. But before we get into the actual canonical history of the railroad, we have to look at the in-game history of this map. So, back in November 2020, I decided the Roblox Train cartoon needed a secondary cast for some reason. I don't know, the first one was just boring. This secondary cast would comprise of 5 characters, first name Grant, second Mackie, third Annie, fourth Craig, and then later on, about a month later, Andy. I actually already thought up of a route, map for their segments to take place on, which I actually built all the way back in May 2020. The episodes would contain them doing rather silly, yet train-related things. In January 2021, I would upgrade the map to make it look more green and added some vegetation and scenery. However, this version of the map was gone to the sands of time. Then something big came. In March 2021, the show had a reboot where we had this completely new map, and thus came a completely different game. The game doesn't work today, but I still have a few surviving photos of it. When the old map crashed, we had to switch over to a more low-poly looking map. The episodes filmed on this are considered the absolute worst of the RTC's history. But in March 2022, a user by the name of Labor8348, which is a friend of mine, came forward to completely rebuild the KNN from the ground up, and now we have this. So now that we have the basic history of the in-game map, or maps, now let's get into the canonical history of the Knokov&Northern. Back in 1873, a deal was made for a railroad connecting Junction City and Acme in Ohio to be built. However, construction didn't commence until 1881. It took one long year, and at least 3 people died during the process. All of them, eerily, are still unknown to this day. Surprise! It's 1882 and the line's finally completed. Now we just need someone to run it. Oh, who's that? Oh, it's Glenn Hartman, a wealthy businessman that lives in the nearby town of Owen. Now it should be noted that he wasn't in this for just the money. Well, he wanted that too, but he was actually in it because he actually loved railroading. His first order of business was to order steam engines. They ordered 4 in total, those being number 720, Owen, number 722, Barney, number 723, Old Jones, and number 724, Craig. These 4 engines would run the line for many years into the turn of the 20th century, in fact. This is where the KNN makes their first big move. In 1905, they would start connecting themselves to the outside world via an interchange that went from Junction City to Trinidad and then to Ruston. The project took a year and a half, $14 million in today's money, and surprisingly, nobody died. This turned out to be one of the best decisions the railroad ever made, and the towns that it connected started to see huge economic growth. However, not everything was going well during this time. On the night of September 9th, 1912, number 724 Craig was leaving out of Junction City with a midnight passenger service. The train was making amazing time, and they made it to Acme by 12:15, and then they left at 12:20. And then they passed the signal, which is actually a pretty essential part of this story, because it was reading green when it was supposed to be set to danger. Also, I'm sorry if the signal looks a little too modern. I'm trying to work with the props I have. The train crossed over a trestle. Good. I might be able to be in bed by 1, the driver thought to himself. Meanwhile, number 720 Owen was doing some late-night switching at Blue Sky Mine, since the orders the day before got all mixed up and he had to sort them out. The crew of 724 rounded the bend, and when they saw him, it was too late. At 12:27 a.m., the train collided with number 720 Owen, and number 724 careened on its side while Owen laid on the ground. While nobody died in this wreck, it's reported that about 7 people were injured. This was the railroad's first accident, and as you can see, it did kind of a lot of damage. After some investigations, the main culprit for the incident seemed to be those darn signals. They were faulty that night, and that makes sense because they were 30 years old at this point. Owen was taken in for repairs, and he was able to go back on the rails in about 2 months. However, they needed to do more work on Craig, so he ended up not coming out until 6 months later. Oh yeah, and there's this one itsy bitsy thing that happened in 1917, and that itsy bitsy thing is America joining World War One. During this rather patriotic time in America's history, the K&N saw an increase in traffic due to the shipping of ammunition, materials, and supplies. This was also a very strange time for America's railroads because the United States Railroad Association, or USRA for short, consolidated all railroads into one big government body. However, the K&N found a loophole in all of this. Since the K&N was a family-owned business from the start, they technically couldn't be taken over by the USRA. The K&N 1, the United States government 0. The 1920s started off strong for the Knokov&Northern with the loaning of 3 new locomotives. Those being Union Pacific number 4428, 060 switcher from the Union Pacific, number 2681, a consolidation from the Southern Pacific, and Canadian Pacific number 38, another consolidation. These 3 locomotives were loaned out to help with the stupid amount of traffic coming in from the interchange this decade. And in that regard, they were a big help. During this time, the K&N also upgraded their rolling stock. They began by ordering a fresh out of the factory rake of 12 Pullman coaches, 6 stored at Junction City and 6 at Trinidad. They ordered some more sturdy rolling stock like boxcars and tankers, mostly made out of steel. They replaced most of their gondolas with hoppers, and add the cherry on top, cabooses, mostly bay windows though. The K&N reported a 30% increase in traffic during this period, and as you could tell, that made them quite a lot of money. And that money was going to come in handy for what was about to come. In 1929, the stock market crashed, causing the entire world to be thrown into an economic frenzy. Millions went without jobs. Many would begin setting up DIY houses since they couldn't pay rent for their own anymore. The K&N, unable to pay their employees, started laying them off, and then put their regular locomotives into storage. Yet they would be put back into service after their financial situation got too bad. This man would fight tooth and nail to make sure the company didn't go into receivership or just straight up go bankrupt. The first thing he did was introduce a new service called the Morning Muffin, a service that would start at Junction City, stop at Acme, then continue through Junction City again to Trinidad. The service proved quite popular for its time because there weren't any passenger trains connecting Trinidad yet. Plus, Trinidad was already a booming town with a depot and everything. Soon, the Canada was getting back on its feet, with them getting almost all their losses back by 1936. It was around this time in 1937 that number 724 Craig would receive brass fittings and some new paint. Now this is where Glenn Hartman's son, Davis Hartman, comes into the fold. So one day back in 1938, Glenn came up to his son and said, "Hey boy, Daddy kinda doesn't want to run the railroad anymore. Can you do it?" Davis said okay, and now he's in control of the railroad. However, around the world, things were about to get insane. On September 1st, 1939, a man with a silly mustache decided to invade the capital of Poland, which was Warsaw, thus kicking off World War II. The United States stayed relatively involved in the whole conflict until the Japanese forced their hand when on December 7th, 1941, they bombed Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. Because of the war, there was a huge increase in traffic around the railroad. To help with all of this, they brought a new big 210 from the nearby Cadenville Railroad, number 1109. She helped the K&N immensely through the war years since the older engines just couldn't deal with the workload anymore. But then, on August 9th, 1945, the Japanese surrendered to the United States after they bombed two of their cities with nukes. Tens of millions died in the fight for freedom, but in the end, they still won. After this, the K&N was significantly worn down and was in need of a rebuild. They kicked off this new rebuilding project in 1946 with a completely new roundhouse. Next, they would modernize their signaling systems and their crossings. They would build a brand new coaling tower at Acme. There was going to be a new coaling tower at Blue Sky Mine, but however, that wouldn't be built until 1949. In 1950, the neighboring Cadenville Railroad were experiencing an engine shortage. Because of this, number 722 Barney and number 723 Old Jones had to be sold to them. Neither of them came back, and they're still owned by the Cadenville to this day. Now only two of the four original engines who ran the line, number 724 Craig and number 721 Owen, were left. In 1950, to fill in the void that Barney and Old Jones left behind, the K&M brought in a new GS5, number 4451, from the Southern Pacific. Just like 1109, he was called over to help with the heavy freight that was going over the railroad since the war. And that brings us to the next stage in the K&N's history. In 1952, the K&N Railroad will start a new service called the Lakeville Limited that would run from Junction City to Acme and then nonstop to Greenwood on the other side of the K&Nville Railroad. The service proved to be extremely popular with people who like to travel on a regular basis. However, the railroad still had one more problem to iron out. The line hasn't had a proper switcher for the last 5 years now. So in 1954, the railroad would order the Great Northern Railway number 27, a B-26 switcher from, you guessed it, the Great Northern. This engine will prove versatile for both switching and short freight hauling. As per tradition with this company, something bad was about to come their way. In the early morning hours of April 24th, 1954, number 1109 crashed off of a bridge in Acme Valley. The damage was extensive, and these are the only few photos left in existence of the incident. This is often regarded as the absolute worst wreck in the railroad's history, which, I agree with that statement. Just look at it. Some of the wreck was salvageable, but the engine itself was sent to the scrapyard for parts. Surprisingly, the caboose, which was the closest to the engine, managed to survive the wreck. Nobody knows how, but it just did, and it stayed in service for many more years until the 1980s. This left the railroad with only 4 engines that were serviceable now. Later, in 1955, number 27, the K&N switcher for the past year or so, was repainted into black. However, the Great Northern Railway logo would stick around for another 7 years. This year, the K&N will make another big purchase by finally replacing 1109 with B&O USRE Pacific number 5213, which was actually bound for the Cutter's Torch. Number 5213 managed to turn out quite flexible since it was mixed traffic, meaning it can pull both passengers and freight. Also, fun fact. Number 5213 technically wasn't owned by the K&N. She was just on a long-term loan from the Cadenville Railroad, which wasn't too far west. Usually long-term loans can last 30 years, so that means 5213 could have stayed all the way up until the mid-90s. And while the K&N was still using steam locomotives regularly, not everybody was treating steam locomotives so kindly. Starting in the early 1950s, most Class 1 railroads would start withdrawing and retiring their steam engines from service in favor of the newer diesel technology. However, the K&N became more popular because they held on to steam longer than other places. This would generate a lot of attention from local train enthusiasts, and the K&N became sort of a tourist attraction. But David Hartman was still curious about new diesel technology. So in the spring of 1959, the K&N brought 2 new diesels. Number 1426, an F7 from the Milwaukee Road, and number 801, an Alco S2 from the Reading and Northern. They would stay on the K&N until 1962, and the fact that they didn't do well is kind of an understatement, to be honest. They were breakdown at the worst possible time and causing accidents while switching. After they were sent back to the Milwaukee Road in Reading and Northern in 1962, the K&N decided how about they stay all steam all the time. However, elsewhere, the industry was heading for disaster. Throughout the 1950s and 60s, air travel became more popular in the United States. Not to mention the average citizen could afford their own car. And while a cross-country train ride would take a few days or so, a cross-country flight would only take a few hours. Because of this, people simply didn't have the same need for the railroads anymore. However, David had a plan. Again. Throughout the railroad's history, the Canaan's main commodity was freight, and since shipping it through the mountains on road wasn't easy, they stayed pretty relevant. Not to mention the huge amount of tourism they got for being the only steam operated railroad in the area. Plus, the only way to travel through the mountains was by rail, so their passenger services stayed afloat as well. In 1966, the K&N would purchase a rake of six Southern Pacific Daylight coaches, which were recently withdrawn from service. The set would be stored at Junction City and would be used for the Lakeville Limited. On an unrecorded date in 1967, the railroad's 060 switcher number 27 suffered catastrophic piston failure outside of Blue Sky Mine while shuttling hoppers from Blue Sky Mine to Acme. It would later be discovered that the engine was in dire need of an overhaul and was sent away for one. While 27 was away, Nelson Hartman, David Hartman's son, became the manager of the K&N. His first move as manager would be to order an 060T saddle tank from the Ann Arbor Harbor Belt number 126. This locomotive would be purchased to fill in for number 27, who we recently mentioned. Later that year, the railroad's GS5, number 4451 would receive a new paint scheme, with number 126 following soon after. Hooray! We've entered the 1970s, and what's changed? Well, the 060 switcher number 27 came back. That's a plus. Really, the only visual change from this overhaul is that they removed the Great Northern logo that stuck with it, later being replaced with the K&N's own logo. So he would take over switching duties at Junction City, while 126 took charge of Acme and Blue Sky Mine. Almost as soon as 27 came back, number 721, Owen, would be sent away for an overhaul as well, as he hasn't received one since after the war in 1947. And he would haul a farewell train before his overhaul was meant to take place in 1972. However, during the climb to Acme, the train stalled as a result of extra strain on the engine, so number 724, Craig, was called up to assist. After this incident, Owen would have been stored at Trinidad until the diesel came to take him away. It was around this time, in 1973, that the K&N would start a new service, the Acme Dairy Service. It would originate at Junction City, dropping off two cars at Acme and then going all the way to Trinidad. However, Trinidad would be cut from the route in 1982. Not much exciting stuff happened in the 1970s on the Knokov&Northern, except for the addition of number 425, an Atlantic from the nearby Caneville Railroad. Despite there being no photos left in existence of the locomotive, it was well received by crews because it had a mechanical stoker on board. In May of 1975, number 4451 would derail at Trinidad Yard while maneuvering for a freight run back to Junction City. This was the result of the front bogie having a faulty spring, a problem that's been around for years at this point. That's probably not what it was, but I digress. While 4451 was away, number 5213, the Pacific, was employed on the Lakeville Limited. Here's some footage. Later in 1975, number 721, Owen finally came back to the K&N sporting a brand new green livery like Craig. However, the executives would choose to repaint him into the original crimson livery. Also, 4451's back. From 1976 to 1980, several sightings would be reported of, quote, 1109's ghost from the 1954 crash. It should be noted that these claims were coming from hippies with no jobs. There's not much else that happened in the 1970s, so let's just move on to the next segment. The 1980s will be kicked off with a brand new rebuilding project at Junction City. This will first start with the K&N's headquarters at Junction City being converted into a whole tower, now known as the JCCT. A new station was constructed as well, along with a few additions at Acme. There was a siding added at Blue Sky Mine, and the track between Junction City and Trinidad was strengthened. A brand new line connecting Blue Sky Mine with the nearby town of Costco was constructed, but then shut down due to the economic crash of 2008, and then reopened again. Did I mention there was a few blocks of houses added to Junction City? During this era, they also got a hold of number 5213, a SD-45 from the Rio Grande. However, he wasn't actually owned by the railroad. He was just on loan. But this is where things get mysterious. On the night of October 13th, 1982, 313 was returning from some late-night switching at Costco. He crossed the bridge near Blue Sky Mine, and then it all went black. Number 5315 fell off of the bridge. Nobody knows exactly how or why, because this bridge was only built the year before. The Knokov&Northern had to pay nearly $9,000 to the Rio Grande for the damages caused, and the engine was scrapped about a week later. Some speculate that this was the curse of 1109. Yeah, sounds cringe, doesn't it? Because that was the same bridge 1109 crashed off of 28 years before. But we all know that ghosts aren't real, right? Right? Again in 1982, the K&N would celebrate their 100th birthday and would cease regular operations for about 3 weeks. For, you guessed it, a gala event. In case you don't know what that is, watch episode 100 of the Roblox Train cartoon. With the centerpiece being number 724 Craig hauling a train on the final day. The crew really pushed the locomotive to its limits on this trip, even making it to 50 miles an hour in some areas. 1983 to 1986 were pretty quiet years for the K&N. Until in 1987, number 5213's lease from the B&O finally expired, but there was just one problem with that. The Baltimore and Ohio simply didn't exist as a corporate entity anymore. So the executives just sold her to the nearby Knokov Railroad. To replace 5213, in 1988, the Knokov&Northern Railroad brought NKP number 765 from the Fort Wayne Railroad Historical Society. She will mainly be used for freight work, but sometimes on passenger duties. This locomotive will prove to be very popular with rail fans on the K&N, and she started to be used more on the Lakeville Limited in favor of 4451. But elsewhere, number 724 Craig was starting to become more and more unreliable as the 1980s drew to a close. So until the K&N could find someone to rebuild him, he was put on display outside of Junction City. The world wasn't kind to number 724, though, as he would face corrosion due to being sit in the open sun. Plus, he would face heavy vandalism. Fortunately, in 1989, the Knokov&Northern finally found somewhere for Craig to be restored, and he was sent there for his restoration. It's now 1990, and a lot of goods are coming through the K&N right now, especially Trinidad. To deal with the sudden increase of freight cars that needed switching, in 1992, the K&N brought a brand new SW100 switcher number 333. He was trialed at Blue Sky Mine and he proved successful. And he was allocated to Trinidad, where he would switch cars for the next 20 years. During this time, in 1993, Thompson Hartman would become manager of the K&N, often referred to as Train Boy. About a year later, Craig would also come back. In case you're wondering where Owen is, he got sold off to the Cadenville back in 1990, and we don't know his exact whereabouts today. Also, here's something I forgot. In 1992, one of the executives on the K&N's director board, Doug Maxwell, would introduce the red herring. It would run from Greenwood on the Cadenville Railroad to Ruston on the Conrail's trackage. From there, it would be taken over by a K&N engine, and then would run all the way to Junction City. The boxcars would go back to Greenwood the next morning. Speaking of the red herring, on the night of November 29th, 1994, number 765 was heading for Junction City with the red herring. She was going about 60 miles an hour at the time. At Trinidad, a late-night freight was awaiting clearance to continue onto the main line. Somehow, the points got switched onto that siding. 765 entered Trinidad, and then they slammed into the back of the freight train. 765 was sent careening onto its side, while the caboose was destroyed on impact. Fortunately, nobody in the caboose was killed because they were on standby duty. But for the engineer, Quinn Potomac, he was lodged under the frames for 8 hours. That was the same amount of time that it took to clean up the whole mess. They ended up amputating his left arm. Also, fun fact, the engine at the front of the train that got hit would later become an engine owned by the K&N. 765 will be the last to be removed from the wreck, but she was seen as salvageable, so she was sent away for restoration. This wreck was so bad that it ranked second on the top 3 worst crashes in the Knokov&Northern history, with the Boulder incident, which we'll talk about later, third, and the crash in 1954 first. The K&N was now left with only 5 engines to their name. So in February 1995, they added 2 more. The first one being 1523, a T-54 Mountain Tank from the Frisco, and number 1500, a N-10 Mikado from the Western Pacific. 765 returned to service July that year, and this caught the attention of local rail fans. So a group of amateur filmmakers / rail fans teamed up with the K&N to make a VHS called The Duality of Steam. It was a 25-minute showcase of how the railroad operated. Sadly, there are no copies of the tape left in existence, mainly because it sucked. And on September 22, 1995, the Burlington Northern and Santa Fe Railroad came together to create Burlington Northern and Santa Fe, or BNSF for short. This new railroad would have over 32,000 miles of trackage across 20 U.S. states. And in 1996, they tried to take over the K&N and its trackage. This caused a legal dispute between the BNSF and the Knokov&Northern because, technically speaking, they couldn't be absorbed into the merger because they were a family-owned business, even after all this time. So in the end, BNSF backed off, but they're still competitors to this day. Basically, nothing happened on the K&N from the years 1996 to 1999. So let's just skip to the night of December 31st, 1999. This New Year's was special because not only was it a new year, but it was also a new millennium. For the event, the K&N had all their engines huddled up at Junction City and had them all whistle and honk in unison when the clock hit 12. Here's some footage from that night. Hooray! It's now the 2000s on the K&N. And, oh crap, here comes another small accident. On the morning of March 4th, 2000, number 1500 got his tender stuck in a turntable well after heavy rain the day before basically wetted the tracks and made it harder to stop. This put the turntable out of action for 5 hours and damaged the engine's tender. But 765 was out of service for her federal inspection, so they just paired 1500 up with her tender. And in retrospect, it doesn't look too bad, right? Nothing happened on the K&N until 2008, when the U.S. entered an economic crisis. The situation was worsening throughout 2007, and it proved catastrophic for the Knokov&Northern Railroad. This recession was so bad, in fact, that the K&N was forced to cease all operations for an entire summer. But they were forced to open back up after the financial situation got too bad. Morale around the line and its employees hit an all-time low during this economic crisis. And people simply weren't riding their passenger services anymore, so they had to hold on to freight for the rest of the year. However, there was one ray of light shining its way through. In 2009, the Knokov&Northern was hosting once again another gala event to recoup their losses they got from the recession of 2008. It lasted about 3 weeks, and on the final day, number 4451 would take the Lakeville Limited and its coaches from Junction City all the way to Greenwood in Indiana. The gala proved to be massively successful and earned the company $45,000 in the process. The K&N seemed to be back on its feet, and it would stay like that through the rest of 2009 and into the early 2010s. 2010 to 2018 were pretty quiet years for the K&N until in 2019, a channel known as Frisco Productions would start making a series based off the railroad. It's still going on to this day, and hey, I recommend you go watch it. The K&N was able to stay pretty financially stable even through the pandemic because the residents of Junction City actually knew how to put on a mask. In December 2021, number 3283, 282 Mikado from the Santa Fe, which we previously mentioned in the crash back in 1994, was loaned to the K&N for a few months. During his final day on loan in 2022, he would pull the Lakeville Limited from Junction City to Trinidad. To replace 3283 in March 2022 also, the K&N would acquire number 4431, a K11 Pacific from the New York Central. He would have a break-in run once again on the Lakeville Limited, and he was 15 minutes late. That's not something good to have on your resume as an engineer. It was also around this time that a branch line known only as the Owen branch would start construction. It would connect the main portion of the K&N to the town of Owen. The town was meant to have a statue of the railroad's first manager, Glenn Hartman, so a train was set up there for the occasion. The train went through some mishaps on the way, but eventually it made it to the town. A crane lifted the brass statue onto a podium, and then there was a celebration. And then the month after that, in August 2022, a boulder would find its way on the line and then smashed itself into a train. In the end, they ended up having to blow up the boulder with TNT, and having to pay $2 million for the repairs to the track that they just laid. Only a few days after this, the railroad's mountain type, number 1523, was assigned to Lakeville Limited permanently. This didn't go over well with number 1500, 4451, and number 4330. So what did they do? They sabotaged the train. Because of this, number 1523 would suffer some damage to her brake blocks. For this, 2 of the 3 engines were sent away for a few months as punishment. To compensate for this, and also in August 2022, the K&N would acquire number 3283, who we previously mentioned, and number 2495, an M64 210-2 from the Rio Grande. They would have a break-in run between Junction City and Owen with a few hoppers. Both engines were brought from the Knokov&Northern Railroad nearby, and they performed successfully on the run. So the K&N said, "Hey, why not keep them?" Shortly after this, a couple of numbnuts actually almost started a brush fire when one of them dropped their cigarette. Thankfully, due to the efforts of number 27 and number 333, the crisis was averted. Not much happened throughout later 2022 until number 1500 and 4451 were finally invited back from the Knokov&Northern Railroad. That exact same week, number 4330 would get stuck in a snowdrift after hauling the evening commute. Due to this, about 73 passengers were stuck on the train for about 3 days straight. So you guessed it, number 4451 and 1500 were called up the mountain to assist in the rescue mission. And through blood, sweat, and hypothermia, they finally made it to the side of the avalanche. So number 724, Craig, would be able to haul the train to Costco, its intended destination. This event got a lot of news coverage for the K&N. And anything past this point isn't worth explaining because you can just go watch the episodes. I hope you've enjoyed this deep dive into the history of the Knokov&Northern. This is Fred signing off, and I wish you all a good day.